Welcome everyone to this presentation on ankle beaters and barkers, exploring our ancestors' occupation. I'm Kathy Sherwood and I'd like to spend some time with you chatting about the work that our ancestors did. So what comes to mind if you find your ancestors' occupation given as an ankle beater? Do you immediately think that it was an early version of the term ankle biter, which we sometimes use today to describe very small children? Perhaps you thought a banker had something to do with taking bark off trees, or perhaps working with dogs. More on that later. I don't know about you, but one of my favourite family history activities is finding out what kind of work my ancestors did. I was thrilled to discover that my 3 times great-grandfather had an unusual occupation. He was a commissary during the Napoleonic Wars between about 1812 and 1815. I discovered that a commissary was someone who worked in the commissariat, and the commissariat was a department which supplied the army with food and equipment. However, I wanted to know more about his working life other than just the name of his occupation. Uncovering the life of a commissary meant reading history books about the Napoleonic Wars in the early part of the 19th century. I then searched for records which listed the amount of money he was paid. I learnt more about what tasks he had to do and how dangerous his occupation was during a time of war. So my knowledge went beyond the name of his occupation to discovering more about the conditions of the time and what his work entailed. So why is knowing about an ancestor's occupation so important to family historians? Because we want to know more than just the facts about those who came before us, we look beyond those facts and discover how they made a living. Did this living impact on where they lived and who they associated with? What records did their working life generate? For example, employment registers, tax information, and so on. When talking about the records, what are available for finding occupations? Where else can we learn about the working conditions of a particular occupation? What payment would they have received, and does that occupation still exist today? Did they change occupations or use different terminology to describe it at different times? For example, in census records, going from labourer to mason, carpenter to cabinet maker, or journeyman to master craftsman. Will you see a progression in your ancestors' life? Did they advance from farm labourer to farm owner, or from working on the factory floor to becoming the manager or perhaps even the owner? Perhaps they were lace makers who advanced from being known as the third light lace maker to being referred to as first light, that is, the best lace maker who was always placed closest to the light. Are there some occupations which continue in your family from generation to generation, perhaps even to this day? For example, a farmer, doctor, teacher, labourer, and so on. So what makes our ancestor unique? When we want to establish the identity of an ancestor, we look for a combination of evidence to distinguish one person from another. What was their name? When and where were they born and baptised? Who were their parents? Did they have siblings? Where did they live? Did they marry? Who was their spouse? If they had children, what were their names and when were they born? And last but not least, we look for the work they did over the course of their life. So what are some of the more unusual occupations you might find when you look at the records? Was someone listed as a snob? Certainly not what we mean today, but in the mid-19th century it referred to a cobbler or shoemaker. In 1852 alone, over 250 snobs emigrated to Victoria in Australia. Lector is Latin for one who reads, whether aloud or not, and can refer to a religious leader or reading scriptures, a voiceover artist, and even a person who reads books aloud to workers in Cuban cigar factories. A Gandhi dancer was an early railroad worker in the US who later maintained railroad tracks. A farrier specialised in the care of horses' hooves, trimming and balancing them and placing shoes. Jagger, not Mick, was a carrier, carter or hawker of fish. Cordwainers were shoemakers. A poller was a barber. A camelteer was a camel driver. Afghanis came to Australia in the mid-19th century to take on this role. A peddler usually referred to a travelling vendor of goods, also known as hawkers. A bower maiden was a lady in waiting for nobility or a chambermaid. And a gilder applied gold leaf to objects such as books, ornaments, jewellery and pottery, etc. So where can I look? Occupations can be found in a variety of record types. The most obvious is in vital records, births, baptisms, deaths, marriage records. Check the census records. Have a look in the post office and city directories. Obituaries in newspapers and immigration records. You might also find occupations in military records, employee registers, such as for teachers, and perhaps even in personal papers. And don't forget to look for an occupation in wills and probate records too. Let's look at some examples of occupations found in some of these records. So here's a birth registration from 1872, and it gives the father's occupation as a lumberer, meaning that he was a timber getter or a lumberjack. Here's a marriage certificate from 1911. It shows the groom's occupation as an engine fitter. In later records, this man's occupation was recorded as engineer. Here's a death certificate from Texas in 1921, which shows that this man died at a young age of 47 and was a farmer. Here's another example of a death registration. This one is different because it has both the occupations for father and son. The son did not have a profession necessarily listed, but his rank, which was gentleman, probably meaning that he was retired in this instance, given that he was 85 years old. His father, on the other hand, was a shoemaker. This 1881 census extract is from a small village in Norfolk, England, and it demonstrates the mix of occupations which can be found in one place even at that time. The first one in the list is quite obvious. It's a domestic servant, but this person is then followed by an annuitant. This was a term used for someone with an unearned income and included those living off investments or a pension, as well as other forms of unearned income such as inherited wealth or young adults who were supported by their parents. It could also be used to describe people living in institutions such as lunatic asylums where their costs were paid for by charities or their relatives. Then there's the retired currier who dressed in coloured leather after it was tanned, a wool stapler who was a dealer in wool, a scholar referred to someone still at school. The cabinet and chair maker is fairly self-explanatory, but the next two are really interesting. Here we have Susanna Smith and her nephew. Susanna is an astrologer and William is a student in astrology. And the final occupation is dressmaker, retired. Let's look at some occupations on electoral roll in Australia, as Australia does not have census records. Some of the occupations in the list, we have a clerk, a draftsman, a bricklayer, a dressmaker, lots of women with domestic duties, and they are all women, a contractor and a civil servant and a tailor. Here's a directory, a post office directory for 1858 in Dublin, Ireland. You can see here the range of occupations. We have a solicitor, a grocer, a postmaster, the apothecary, a surgeon, a tailor, a superior in a monastery, which probably means he was the chief abbot, a professor of dancing, and a fruit salesmaster. Now, using the same directory, we can see who lived or worked in the same street, which helps with determining the fan club, the friends, associates, and neighbours of your ancestor, who will always give you clues as well. So in this particular street, we can see that we have a hotel and tavern keeper, an umbrella maker, and a building surveyor and a licensed appraiser. Newspapers, particularly obituaries, can provide a wealth of information, as this example shows. Dr. Bowker was an MLC. That is, he had been a member of the Legislative Council in New South Wales. So in this obituary we find his age, his date of birth and where he was born. Terrific information. But with regards to his occupation, we know that he was a surgeon. He served his apprenticeship in the Nottingham General Dispensary and then studied medicine in Scotland and later London and Paris. Sometimes Freemasons and Oddfellows and similar organisations invited members to attend the funeral of a deceased member. So here we have an example of a funeral notice for William Coleman. The top entry is a general notice about his funeral, but the second is a request for members of the Perseverance Lodge in Brisbane to attend. William died in Brisbane, but he had been a member of the Pioneer Lodge in Rockhampton. Here's a passenger list showing assisted immigrants to New South Wales in 1886. On this list there's 2 miners, there's 2 miners, a plate layer, a brakesman and a woodcarver. The brakesman worked on the railways and his job was to assist the braking of a train by applying brakes on individual wagons. A plate layer or trackman was a railway employee whose job it was to inspect and maintain the railway tracks. When the whole of the passenger list is examined, railway workers appear to be the most common occupation. So if you're unsure of their location when they arrive, for example, go and look for places where the railway was being expanded. Remember too that certain occupations are often clustered together depending on the location. An important seaport such as Southampton in the south of England would have these occupations, whereas an inland city like Oxford would not. So you can see that we have sailmakers, shipbuilders, rope makers, coopers, mariners, of course, and chandlers. Migration patterns can also help with identifying occupations. It's estimated that between 1861 and 1901, about 250,000 Cornish people migrated, with miners making up most of the numbers. Many of these people went to Australia and the USA, but others emigrated to New Zealand, Canada, Brazil and South Africa. There's a well-known saying in Cornwall that a mine is a hole anywhere in the world with at least one Cornishman at the bottom of it. If you have difficulty finding your ancestors' occupation, then you may need to look beyond the obvious records already mentioned. Passport applications and naturalisations or citizenship applications should be investigated. See if there are any trade association registers or union membership records. Perhaps even trade journals may mention your ancestor. Was your ancestor a member of a London livery company or guild? If so, be aware that sometimes members joined a livery company which had no relationship to their occupation, but simply because its fees were lower. Historical newspapers can contain a wealth of information. Were legal notices placed for probate or insolvency? Was their death or notice of their funeral included, and what organisations were invited to attend the funeral? Advertisements may have been placed in the newspaper, especially when the business opened or closed. Did your ancestor have hobbies, play sport or volunteer? Did they belong to organisations and associations such as Freemasons and Oddfellows? You may find membership registers in subscription sites like Ancestry. Are there any family heirlooms which may give a clue? For example, membership pins, awards, watches from a workplace on retirement, photographs showing the work, or certificates and awards. You could also invest tax records if these are available to you. Searching all of these avenues and more may help you find what you're looking for. But if you're still having difficulty, then another option is to use a search engine. This is a search I did which came up with 2 possibilities. The second highlighted one gives James Phillips's occupation and that he was born in Bacchus Marsh in Victoria. So now I have a starting point to research further. Are there Victorian railway records? Is he mentioned in newspapers around this time? If you're looking for an obsolete occupation, then a search engine can be a really useful tool to investigate it and find out more. If you're using FamilySearch, go to the catalogue and search for your locality to see if there are any records, books and similar for occupations. So for example, when I search for my home state of Queensland, Australia, Occupations has 7 entries and there are 6 indexes. In Ancestry, enter occupation or employment in the card catalogue under keywords. For Find My Past, select all record sets and enter occupations as a keyword, and then you can filter it by country. And I hear you all asking, what did an ankle beater and a barker do? Well, apparently an ankle beater is the origin of what we call ankle biter today. You see, ankle beaters were usually young boys who beat the ankles and lower legs of cattle to move them along on their way to market. They were also known as penny boys because they received 1 penny per head as payment. Harper's Magazine, as early as 1850, was the first to use the term ankle biters in a publication. A barker was a person who used tree bark in the leather tanning process. A barker could also refer, though, to the person who attempted to attract patrons to entertainment. Let me leave you with a well-known nursery rhyme about 3 occupations, 2 of which are still with us today, but one is now, well, fairly obsolete, except perhaps for some hobbyists.
Rub-a-dub-dub, 3 men in a tub, and who do you think they'd be? The butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, and all of them out to sea.
Thank you for watching my presentation. Be sure to download the handout for further information and links to various sites, which will give you definitions for numerous occupations. To find my other presentations and for more great content, check out the RootsTech page.